welcome to 168 Hours. My name is Razmik Martirosyan, and today, together with my colleague Dr. Artur Khachikian, we will interview Mr. Douglas Macgregor, a retired US Army colonel, and Christina Arakelian, a senior economic and business management consultant and currently a fellow at the Armenian Society of Fellows. It's great to see you. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. And may I just say, Colonel, how honored we are to have you with us. Thank you so much for finding some time. Thank you for your service. And just personally from me, thank you for the struggle that you're waging to bring the United States back on track. I'm a U.S. citizen, and I'm very partial to what you're doing and one of your supporters. So thanks again. And thanks, Christine, for finding the time.
Thank you, Arthur.
Thank you. Razmik, do you want to lead with the first question, or would you like me to go ahead? You tell me.
You can go ahead. You can go ahead.
Okay. So, gentlemen and ladies, we've just witnessed some pretty unprecedented events in the Middle East. They're going to change the entire security architecture of this region. Another first for me personally is to see a leader of a terrorist organization formerly associated with Al-Qaeda, an official terrorist organization designated as such by the United States, now being supported directly and indirectly by the West and some of its regional allies. I mean, this is something we were not taught back at Stanford, so this is a pretty interesting little anecdote. So after these events, clearly this was a big blow against Russia and Iran, huge credit, and we may expect to see increased influence for Turkey and Israel in the region. We are not too far. Transcaucasus is very, very close to this region. And what do you think this means for the security in our region, for the relationship between Russia, Iran, on the one hand, Turkey and the West on the other? As you know, we're a playing ground for the big powers, so to speak. So how will this reverberate, in your opinion, in our region?
I think your comment about being roughly 300 miles at most from the scene of the action in Syria is a very appropriate one. But I think your listeners need to understand that the United States is even further, far further. And there is very little attention inside the United States focused on what happens overseas. That may come as a surprise to people, but as a result of the really minimal interest that most Americans have in what happens beyond their borders, has allowed a series of administrations, presidents, and the intelligence agencies that serve them, such as the Central Intelligence Agency, to conduct operations without necessarily consulting the American people or their representatives. In other words, I would argue that right now, a lot of news is coming in that suggests that something dramatic has happened in the Middle East. It's getting some attention. But in fact, our position in the Middle East and our conduct of policy has been on autopilot. We began this process in early 2011. President Obama signed an order directing the Central Intelligence Agency to begin working to systematically overthrow, undermine, destroy, if you will, the Assad regime in Syria. We're now seeing this come to fruition. Also, in this process, we've naturally been assisted by Turkish intelligence, Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, and obviously UK intelligence. So this has been going on for quite a while. So when we talk about rebranding former ISIS terrorists or Al-Qaeda terrorists or Al-Nusra terrorists, the rebranding has been ongoing for some time, re-equipping, reorganizing, and we have obviously tried very hard to coach and move them in the direction that we would like them to go. But as usually happens with these kinds of operations, now that it's underway, I don't think we're going to have as much influence over these actors as we hoped. So with that, I'll turn it over to Christine so she can comment further.
Christine, go ahead, please.
Sure. So look, the fall of Assad is a colossal win for both Turkey and Israel. And I think that has been sort of a pretty consistent theme as you look at analyses across the globe. Now let's look at this in terms of its impact on Armenia, okay? So we have the SNA, the Syrian National Army, which is backed by the Turks. And we have HTS, which is the Al-Qaeda breakoff group that now controls about 70% of Syria, okay? Then we also have the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are the Kurdish group backed by the United States government. The ability of Armenia to influence things at this point is incredibly limited. And a lot of what happens to Armenia is going to depend on the interaction of those three key groups together with external players. So let's just get a little bit more specific, okay? First of all, there's a key question, and the key question is this: to what extent does HTS have strategic autonomy from Turkey? Okay, it's well acknowledged basically that the Turks had a very major role in the overthrow of Assad, not just through the support of the SNA, but also in providing intelligence and other materials to HTS. Okay, so to what extent does HTS then have strategic autonomy moving forward? Okay, so why does this matter? Because at the end of the day, Russia is going to need to cut a deal to keep its air base and its naval base in Syria. This is well understood. And insofar as the Turks basically have an overwhelming influence or outcome determinative input on whether that takes place or not, I think what we can expect to see is effectively a quid pro quo between Turkey and Russia as it pertains to the Caucasus and Zangezur. Now, this isn't just speculation on my part. For people who have been thinking very deeply about the matter and actually speaking with the Turks, this is starting to get reported in the media. And I would point people to Timothy Ash and some of his most recent statements on Substack to see that people are actually talking about this. It's not actually getting a lot of press, okay? Meanwhile, we see Azerbaijan, two senior officials from AIPAC. AIPAC is the Israeli lobbying group in the United States, actually met with the Azeri government in the past 2 days, okay? So you have to ask yourself, why is a US lobbying group meeting with foreign leaders? You really have to ask yourself this, okay? And I don't think at this point they're even trying to hide anymore the influence that Azerbaijan and Israel have in US politics. This is why you have a US-based lobbying group actually going and flying to meet with foreign leaders. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan is basically saying that they're now going to be an intermediary, a quiet one, between Israel and Turkey. So if you add it all up, basically Armenia is greatly weakened, okay, in terms of its overall posture in the region. And I do understand that the Pashinyan government feels quite confident about US support at this point. What I would say is this. First of all, the Trump appointees, they're overwhelmingly pro-Israel. I think that that's a fair statement. It remains to be seen the extent to which Boulos and others basically have influence within the administration. We don't actually know. But at this point, the US has been working alongside the Kurds in northeastern Syria for a period of years. And the US continued support of the Kurds is actually at risk. So if that's at risk, why does Armenia feel confident over the next 4 years in the Trump administration that they are not at risk? That somehow things are all basically secure in terms of Armenia's relationship with the United States, okay? Are the Armenians going to be treated better than the Kurds? The Kurds have actually fought alongside with the United States for a period of years and were a key part of defeating ISIS. So you really have to ask yourself, what does Armenia offer that's greater basically than the Kurds and maintaining a presence in northeast Syria, which is exactly where their oil wells are. So I'm throwing this out here only because none of us actually know what the future will bring. But I think we need to be honest about what will take place, what could take place, and how the various actors are acting to their own self-benefit. I'd like to see Armenia have a realistic analysis of what could take place so basically that we can position ourselves accordingly.
Speaking to that, I've been listening to Colonel Macgregor for a long time, and he has been very explicit and very persuasive in describing the influence of foreign organizations and lobbying organizations, domestic lobbying organizations on U.S. foreign policy. We all know that AIPAC is an incredibly powerful organization that has a pretty much decisive influence over the U.S. foreign policy in this region. And we also know that Israel and Azerbaijan are pretty much strategic allies. Israel helped Azerbaijan defeat Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan has been supplying oil and gas to Israel and pretty much supporting the genocide in Gaza. So, and in the new administration, from what I understand, Israel is going to take a very, very important role, even more so than before. So in these circumstances, can we really say that Armenia will have any kind of influence or any kind of place for the U.S., for U.S. in U.S. foreign policy? I mean, to your knowledge, Colonel and Christine, is Armenia really strategically important for the United States? Are there U.S. interests in Armenia as opposed to, let's say, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Israel?
Well, under normal circumstances, in the absence of this thing we call the American-Israeli Political Action Committee, I would tell you that our interests in this region of the world are really modest. In other words, we have no passionate commitment one way or the other to what's happening in the region. Unfortunately, for the reasons that you've cited, due largely to enormous amounts of money that are donated to people in office, primarily for the purpose of rewarding them for their support to Israel or putting them at risk for not supporting Israel. This outsized influence is a very real thing. And at the moment, I think exactly what you said earlier, everyone in this administration has made it abundantly clear that they strongly support effectively whatever the Israelis want. Now, having said that, is there any way to approach the United States government and Israel in the hopes of protecting Armenian interests in the Caucasus? I think there is some. And people will say often, well, you know, President Trump loves Armenians. President Trump loves everybody. He always has. President Trump is not someone who hates anyone. I worked with him. I know that to be true. And he's very emotional when it comes to particularly, I would argue, Christians. But he's the sort of person who, on the one hand, wants to find a path forward that will be both good for the people in the region, wherever it is, as well as for the United States. He's constrained. He's constrained by a bureaucracy that is really largely in the hands of people. And this has developed over many decades now, who frankly don't really agree with President Trump's views. So even, you know, President Trump made a statement the other day that we should have nothing to do with what is happening today in Syria. Well, I think most Americans would agree with that, and I'm sure they do. Unfortunately, we're involved up to our necks, and it's rather comical to suggest that we want nothing to do with it. We're already in it. And I think the key thing for Armenia to understand is that we've unleashed several tigers in the neighborhood. And however nice we may have been to the tigers in the past, the tigers are probably going to eat whatever is in front of them. Now, there's good news and bad news. The Israelis have already begun to figure this out. People are talking about the Israeli land grab south of Damascus. Well, having seen that area, there's not much to grab. There's not much between the Israeli border and Damascus that anybody would want to have. But they see that obviously as a security zone. However, the Israelis are also talking about seizing and occupying Damascus and making that part of the Greater Israel Project. That is going to present enormous problems for them, particularly with the Turks. The Turks are going along with things because they see an advantage to it. And their presence now inside Syria, especially as they move their armed forces south, and they've already got intelligence officers forward, they've moved more troops into the area they currently occupy, they're inevitably going to be interested in removing the Kurdish problem once and for all. And as Christine pointed out, I don't think we're going to stand in that way, at least not initially. And the second part is that the Turks have an interest in northern Iraq. Turkish generals have told our senior officers in Iraq ever since, I would argue, 1991, informally in discussions, Kirkuk is a Turkish city. Don't forget that. That is ours. They mean it. They're not kidding, and Erdogan means it. The last point I would make is that Mr. Erdogan in private, I am told, is actually far, far, far more aggressive and hostile to everyone who is not a member of the Muslim Brotherhood than people realize. In other words, publicly, he tries to present himself as being more moderate, but in reality, he is not. These things are going to become an issue for the Israelis. The Israelis have moved forces along their southern border, along the Golan Heights, because they know his influence is going to have an impact on them. And it's probably not going to be positive. By the way, his influence is reaching into Jordan. Jordan is very unstable. Hundreds of millions of dollars pour into Jordan on a regular basis to try and help pacify this boiling pot of discontent. And it's even worse in Egypt in many respects, because the Muslim Brotherhood is very strong there. And of course, Mr. Erdogan is, regionally speaking, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. So Israel seems to have benefited and thinks it's riding high in the saddle. But in fact, it's a lot closer to the tigers wandering through the neighborhood than it really wants to be at this point. And how much can we do in the event of a serious conflict in that region beyond air and naval power? We simply don't have very much in the way of ground forces, and most of them are sitting pointlessly in Eastern Europe, waiting for a so-called Russian attack on NATO that's never going to come. So you put all of this together, and you got to go back to, where do you stand? Where do you fit in? How do you protect yourselves? It's always a bad idea for any state to be hostage to the readiness of a larger state to help them. It's dangerous. Whatever you can do to protect yourselves, whatever alliances you can make, whatever agreements you can reach to protect yourselves, I think it's in your interest to do so. And again, that's not because I think Americans don't like Armenians. That's nonsense. The opposite's the case. That has nothing to do with it. And it's not a criticism of President Trump. I know where his heart is. His heart is pure. But I know the bureaucracy in Washington, and I know the Hill and the enormous influence that is wielded by certain lobbies like the one that we're discussing, the American-Israeli Political Action Committee. Christine, you want to take that on?
Sure. So you made great points, and I'm going to start by addressing one of the comments you made on Erdogan. Okay. The U.S. has really no experience with the Ottoman Empire. If you think about where the U.S. was in the 19th century, when something called the Eastern Question came into the forefront for European powers, the U.S. was not really involved in that region other than evangelical missionaries going to Lebanon and other parts of the Middle East and establishing colleges and missionaries and things of this sort, okay? And this has created an incredible naivete in Washington, D.C. relative to Turkey and its position in the wider region, okay? There's a thinking in Washington, D.C., and I've seen it firsthand, that the United States can control Turkey. And if we just exert a little bit more pressure on Turkey and constrain them in certain ways and have carrots and sticks, that Turkey is going to do the U.S. bidding. That is completely false, okay? And this is actually going to be a wake-up call, not just for the United States, but particularly for the UK, which has been highly supportive of Turkey now for well over 100 years in terms of its actual control over Turkey and what Turkish nationalism is actually going to mean for the region. There is a reason that the Gulf states, and in particular UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, are concerned about what is taking place in Syria, because they understand that what Turkish nationalism actually means for the region, okay? It's hugely destabilizing. And Turkey is going to seize what in fact is a historic moment and consolidate power, not just in the Levant, but also in the Caucasus out into Central Asia. This is a Neo-Ottoman project, and Erdogan is standing at a historic point in which there's very little limiting him right now. Now, let's turn to Armenia. Your original question was, you know, strategically, how is Armenia viewed? So I'm going to talk about how they're currently viewed in DC, at least from what I observe. And then I'm going to talk about what Armenia is missing, because it's actually it's a more complex analysis than you sort of laid out. In terms of Armenia's overall positioning within Washington, D.C., they call it strategic, but it's not really strategic. What it is basically Armenians fitting in within what I considered to be largely an evangelical framework in which Armenia is positioned as the standard bearer for persecuted Christians throughout the Middle East. Now, I am not downplaying persecuted Christians in the Middle East. I will tell you, though, that in many areas of the Middle East, Christians are not persecuted. I've spent a lot of time in Egypt. Yes, there could be some circumstances in which Christians encounter difficulties, but that, by and large, is not the experience of Armenians in many places of the Middle East. This has become a tool. Armenians have become a tool for evangelicals to create an overarching framework in the Middle East, okay, in which effectively Eastern Christians are actually losing their voice. They're not increasing their voice because Armenians are welcomed when we have talking points from evangelicals, but we're not welcomed when we want to talk about the importance of our own society, Armenia, as well as Armenian communities throughout the Middle East. That's not a welcome discussion. At the end of the day, talking about persecuted Christians doesn't mean that Armenians have a future in that region, okay? So that's unfortunately how we're currently positioned, and I don't actually see that changing. I don't see any impetus to change it because a lot of times the discussion in DC is around generalities and sort of stereotypes as opposed to specifics on the ground. And what people are doing is they're scanning the news to say, what factoid can I pull out of the recent news events that's going to support my byline without actually understand what is taking place on the ground, okay? They need to have more Armenian commentators and other dispassionate commentators who are willing to speak on the truth of Christians in the Middle East versus an agenda item, okay? But unfortunately, the topic of Christians in the Middle East has become an agenda item, okay? Now, let's now talk about what's being missed when people talk about Christians in the Middle East. Armenia needs a strategic and economic future, okay? Its GDP effectively is down. Now, you could say, well, there's still real nominal growth. The growth is down to 5 or 6%, right? If you take a look at the most recent economic forecast, okay, that's still technically growth. But at the end of the day, the economy is taking a hit, okay? And if you actually want to strategically position Armenia, you have to talk about Armenia being integrated into the wider region, okay? Armenia has not been economically integrated into the wider region. And the thing that's disconcerting to me is that actually this has been pointed out to the United States government many times. There is nothing that will help Armenia as much as being economically independent or have greater independence from Russia. Those objectives are currently not being achieved. Meanwhile, Turkey and Azerbaijan are positioning themselves to control basically what is termed the middle corridor to Central Asia, such that Turkey and Azerbaijan have a stranglehold on trade in two key respects. First of which is the middle corridor out into Central Asia. The second of which is the Iraq Development Road, okay, which again cuts out Iran. This puts Turkey again in a hegemonic position relative to Armenia's economic growth, both east-west and north-south. This is catastrophic for Armenia, and regretfully, the United States at this point literally has no counter to China's Belt and Road, okay? Let's be clear. President Biden came out, let's just say, what was it, September of 2023, talking about an IMEC corridor. Okay, so what comes next? IMEC corridor doesn't have any legs anymore. Too much has transpired. It's extremely dated. The Trump administration is saying that China is their strategic priority. Where does Armenia fit into that? Armenia should be a key player, basically allowing the United States to project power into the Caucasus, into the Middle East, into Central Asia. Armenia is not currently positioning itself in that manner. That's the weakness. That's the possibility for Armenia, but that's also the current weakness. And if the United States government doesn't have the vision to implement something like this, then Armenia should be taking the United States government by the hand and showing them how. Okay, because it's long overdue for the United States government to have a success story in that region. At the moment, it really has very little to speak of. So that's where it should be positioned. Now, does that mean that Armenia is distant from its Christian roots? No. But Christians also need to put food on the table and have a growing GDP. And let me just talk a little bit too. I've used this analogy before, but I think it's important for Armenians and others to understand what is the gap in Armenia's wealth, given that it is not integrated into any larger economic frameworks. Okay, well, let's take a look at the breakup of Yugoslavia. We have Croatia. Okay, Croatia's GDP is 3 times that of Armenia with a roughly comparable population. Okay, that's your gap. You have a gap between about 19-20 billion in GDP in Armenia to over 60 billion for Croatia. Okay, that's the difference between being economically integrated and being able to trade versus not. And insofar as Azerbaijan continues to have the overwhelming economic benefit, pushing for a peace treaty between Armenia and Azerbaijan will yield you nothing. It's quite amazing to me the extent to which people think pieces of paper, okay, with signatures on it will eclipse basically continued economic weakness relative to your surrounding countries, which will also create military weakness, okay? This is fundamentally not sustainable. So from my perspective, Pashinyan is prioritizing the wrong things. He has not prioritized basically bringing Armenia up to par in terms of where it needs to be, such that a long-standing peace is sustainable. You have peace from strength, not from weakness.
Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan says that we don't have resources. Azerbaijan is a rich country. It has oil, it has gas. So what should we do in this case?
First of all, I think that greatly overstates the case, and it absolves Pashinyan of responsibility for the current situation that Armenia is in. First of all, let's talk about crossroads of peace, Syunik, Zangezur, whatever terminology that you want to use, okay? That effectively needs to be a land version of the Suez Canal, okay? It's not even close. And I know for a fact that the administration, the Pashinyan administration, has been pushed to actually put meat on the bones, okay, such that that can be a world-class corridor. Now, remember, let's take a look at like Turkey. Turkey runs the Dardanelles, okay? There's treaties, there's sophisticated frameworks and people in which people understand their rights. That's what Armenia needs to come out with, okay? It's the difference between the airport in Yerevan with, say, 5 gates and Dubai, which is a world-class transit. Okay, they both can have airplanes fly in and fly out, but there's a world of difference, right? Well, that's the difference between crossroads of peace and the Dardanelles. At the end of the day, there needs to be meat on the bones, and there needs to be actually a sophisticated plan in which there's multiple stakeholders. In order for Syunik to evolve into a world-class transportation connector, regardless of which direction it is in, it's going to need to have something at that level. It's going to need to be enterprise grade. Okay, so that's point number one. Now you can say, well, okay, Armenia doesn't have that experience. Yes, but Armenia has the ability to get that experience. Armenia, in my opinion, should be doing a deal with Egypt, basically to bring those capabilities to bear in the Caucasus. Now you say to yourself, well, why would Egypt do that? First of all, Armenia and Egypt have historic relationships that are very deep, that are very strong. And second of all, Egypt is one of the biggest losers in terms of Turkish hegemony in the region. And one of the things that the US has missed from a foreign policy perspective is the necessity of balancing Egyptian and Turkish interest in the wider region. This is a huge mistake. Just like there needs to be a balance of power between Saudi and Iran, there also needs to be a balance between Turkey and Egypt. Egypt is, in the words of one general in Egypt that I met, the peer competitor to Turkey. Right, that should be thought of continually by the United States government. And in addition, Egypt has the experience of running Suez. So that's one economic interest that has not been fully developed by Armenia. I did actually speak with someone in the mining industry in Armenia just a few days ago. The mining industry needs investments. One of the key loans for the Armenian mine, I think it's called Lydian, if I'm not mistaken, fell through. Right. Now, if you look at the news reports, basically what they're saying is the shortfall in funding of roughly 100 million USD plus or minus is going to be made up for by the Armenian banks. But I think that misses the point. The point is that when you have foreign investors basically coming in, making enterprise level investments, this actually lends stability to your overall country. Okay. Think of Taiwan. Taiwan makes chips basically for the world. That brings economic stability and political and strategic stability. Now, albeit, I don't want to take the analogy too far, but in other words, foreign investors means somebody has to care about your country because important things are taking place there. At the single time, Armenia finances its own projects. It's less relevant to the actors in the region and the actors basically who are, like the United States, UK, etc. Ultimately, the Armenia may need to have a company that is comparable, let's just say, to BP in Azerbaijan. Currently, it doesn't have one. So I think there's a number of things actually that the Armenian government can do to attract investment, but fundamentally that lack of investment is going to continue insofar as there's geostrategic instability. Hence, even though the US is pushing for a peace treaty, the priority from my perspective is not a piece of paper. It's actually bringing balance to some of the economic and political imbalances that exist in that region, in many respects due to US policies.
To continue this topic, I have a question because we have a intense discussion here in Armenia about the US-Armenian cooperation, and pro-governmental circles in Armenia usually mention that we don't have deeper relations with the US because of Russia, because of Russian military bases in Armenia, and because we are part of CSTO. Do you believe that Armenia is able to leave the CSTO and to ask Russian military bases to leave this country? And after that, what will happen to Armenia?
If I could just clarify for a second. So as my colleague is saying, we have dozens and dozens of media outlets in Armenia that are funded by the West. And these people are telling us quite literally, what you need to do is cut ties with Russia. The moment you cut ties with Russia, the US is going to come. France is going to come. They will bring weapons. You will have military bases. You will have alliances with these countries, maybe even NATO membership. I mean, we all know it's a fairy tale. I mean, to you, but I don't want to bias your answer. I mean, to your knowledge, are there any plans on the part of the US administration, this one or the future one? And I take the point of, that Colonel made. Yes, President Trump has a good heart, but there's a difference between the heart and the foreign policy. These are different things. So in your opinion, is there any prospect of the US or France or any other Western country providing security assistance to Armenia, specifically weapons, military bases, alliances, or security guarantees? In your opinion, I mean, have you heard of anything like that?
I have not, but on the other hand, it's not impossible. The only thing I would point out that should be obvious to everyone is Americans do not live in the Caucasus or Western Asia. This seems to be forgotten. The Europeans are discovering now Americans do not live in Europe. The Europeans are getting a hard lesson, I think, from the Russians that they've got to tend to their own affairs. They cannot abdicate responsibility for their self-protection or their economic strength to the United States. The United States will always take the position that whatever it does is good, and even if that absolutely hurts Europe. And I think we've hurt Europe very, very badly. We don't want to spend time on that, but if you look at it economically, the Nord Stream 2 is a good example. That was catastrophic. I think the Russia piece is very important for Armenia for the following reasons. Our friend Erdogan is nothing if not an historian. And he remembers that Enver Pasha tried very hard to launch a crusade through the Caucasus down into Central Asia, which was Islamist in nature. It failed miserably because the people in Central Asia who were living under the Tsar, they were not necessarily unhappy, and in most cases, they simply sided with the Tsar. They were part of the Tsarist empire, and that was not a burden on them. They saw it as more of a benefit than otherwise. The reason I'm bringing that up is that Erdogan has deep interests in Central Asia. The Russians know that. But I think the Russians have mistakenly looked beyond that and said, well, that was the past. Turkey's a modern state now. They're discovering that Turks are Turks. Turks are not modern Europeans. They're not modern cosmopolitan people living in Lebanon or Beirut. They're Turks. The old interests, the old strategic imperatives are still there. We're watching them unfold in Syria. I've had Turkish officers laugh and tell me that Syria is not an independent country. That's why we don't have an embassy there with a Turkish ambassador. It's a former province, and that's the way we look at it. I think we're in that world now. The Turks feel powerful. They're flush with cash from Qatar that keeps them afloat. They have made this unholy alliance from the Islamic standpoint with Israel as a temporary expedient. That's probably not going to last. In fact, I don't think it will last at all. But it will last long enough for Erdogan to realize his goals, certainly in the Middle East. At least that's his hope. So where does that leave Armenia? Armenia has to understand that American foreign policy and defense orientation is, how do we hurt Russia, which I think is very stupid, and also how do we hurt and bring down Iran? Now, if you're trying to hurt Russia and Iran, what are you going to do for Armenia? Do you want to use Armenia as a platform for attack against Russia, or a platform for attack against Iran? Azerbaijan right now has offered itself up as a platform for attack against Iran. Does Armenia want to go in that route and endear itself to the Americans, only to discover that within 2 or 3 years, the focus in American foreign policy changes completely and we leave? People need to understand we are not a land power in Central Asia. We're not a land power in the Caucasus. You really think that we're going to send 30,000 troops to occupy bases in the middle of Armenia? It's not going to happen. You need to be more realistic about your position. Who can you turn to in an emergency who's going to provide you with some tangible, concrete support? What's happened in Georgia? What have the Georgians done? Georgia went down this route with us. We provided them with the wrong equipment, the wrong military focus based on the stupidity in the Middle East, prepared them for nothing that they faced. And they were taught a lesson by the Russians. That's where I would look and see what has happened to Georgia. What is Georgia doing? What's Armenia going to do? I would ask those questions in the context of where you live in history. We are a fleeting advantage. We're primarily a maritime and aerospace power. We're in and we're out. Our interests are not sustainable in many cases, except in very few places. So we're unpredictable. I love my country and I support my government, but I'm being frank with you. What happened at the end of the Vietnam War? We invested God knows how much money, tens of thousands of lives, and then what did we do? We left and changed the subject. That's my warning.
And it's well taken, Colonel. It's well taken. What happened in Syria? By the way, I have a question in a way to you both. Given what you said about the unleashing the tigers, what do you think will happen in Syria now? I mean, if you look at what happened in Iraq after Saddam Hussein, or what happened in Libya after Gaddafi, you had civil war, you have killings, you have clashes, you have war with the Kurds in one case. In the Libyan case, you have two governments. So in a way, they have unleashed tigers. What's going to happen to Syria? Is the country going to be divided? Are they going to seize territory? What are they going to do with the Kurds? I mean, we're kind of beginning to see what they're planning to do with the Kurds. It started already. And then in the Caucasus, I mean, your point is well taken about Erdogan. Yes, he has plans. He feels strongly that he should build a new Turkic empire or Ottoman empire. Unfortunately for us, we're in the way. And for the West, provoking some kind of conflict in our region would probably force Russia to either get involved in a conflict with Turkey, which Russia absolutely will not want to do, or make a deal or withdraw from the Caucasus, just like it happened in Syria. So what I'm seeing is that there is a tangible Western interest in provoking something in our region to force Russia to leave. And your point is well taken, that we have to think carefully about countries that may have very good intentions, but they are 11,000 kilometers away, and they may come and provide humanitarian assistance and I don't know, maybe provide economic assistance, but in the end, you can see what you saw, that famous shot of a U.S. helicopter being dropped in the ocean of the coast of Vietnam. I think it was 1975, or Afghanistan. Very, very painful footage of people running after airplanes taking off from the airport in Afghanistan. I mean, that was pretty painful for me to see. So those are the two questions. What's going to happen to Syria and who is going to stop Erdogan? And don't you think that some people in the West may want to provoke a conflict to force Russia out?
Well, I think that Erdogan is going to partition Syria, and the south of Syria, certainly Damascus and south, will probably fall under Israeli occupation or control. The Israelis will regard the territory as a security zone for them. And again, they want to try and assimilate Damascus into the greater Israel project. I don't know how that will turn out. That's an interesting development. When it comes to the Caucasus, things are different for Russia. Russia could leave or stay any moment in the Middle East or North Africa. Syria was not a vital strategic interest to the Russians. If the Russians really want a warm water port on the Mediterranean, well, they can get that elsewhere. There are other places who would probably welcome the Russians and admit them. And I wouldn't exclude that possibility across North Africa. So they can find that somewhere else. But the Caucasus, that falls into the area of vital strategic interest. And I don't think the Russians will allow themselves to be ejected from the Caucasus by the United States. And I don't think the Turks will want to fight the Russians in the Caucasus. I think there'll be an uneasy truce on that scale. But I would definitely cultivate the Russians, because the Russians have a long-standing interest in stability in the Caucasus. They fought plenty of Muslims. We can go back to Imam Shamil. The Russians fought him for 20 years. They brought that under control. But even today, in many areas in Russia, there are still Muslims who are capable of radicalization, and they know that. The Russians maintain very close relations with the president of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and Turkestan and so forth. And all of the governments in Central Asia like President Putin, and they describe him as the only one they can depend upon. And who are they fighting? Islamists. And we forget that the president of Uzbekistan a few years ago threw a Turkish ambassador out of the country because this Turkish ambassador was doing what? He was trying to stand up Muslim brotherhoods, cultivating radical madrasas. And the president of Uzbekistan said, I've already got 1,000 of those people in my jails, and I've executed 500 of them. Get the hell out of my country. And he absolutely threw the ambassador out. Erdogan changed his tune, moderated, came back, sent somebody else out that would play the game. Whatever Erdogan wants in Central Asia is one thing, but what he will get is something else. The Russians are not fools, neither are the people ruling in Central Asia. They also have an interest in this Belt and Road. That's a mutually beneficial development. If Central Asia becomes unstable, then it's a problem. So that leaves you with Russia and Iran. Now, what about Iran? We are undoubtedly going to be dragged into a war against Iran. That's eminently clear. That's the goal that Mr. Netanyahu has had forever. The Israelis have got that as on their top of their wish list. And that's what they want. I think they're going to get it. How will that go? I don't think it will go well. Iran is a country of almost 100 million. They can take a lot of damage and they can rebound from it. And once they're under attack, Russia is not going to allow them to go under, because both China and Russia are looking at Asia, and they're viewing this from the standpoint of, where do you stop the advance of this potentially dangerous American foreign policy that spreads chaos and uses others to do it? We've really become managers of chaos, if you look at it from that standpoint. We've created chaos in Libya, created it in Iraq, created it in Syria. Wherever we go, we end up creating chaos because we disturb the normal regional dynamics. So where do you stop it? And the Russians said, we're not going to bother stopping it in Syria. There's nothing that vital to us. And it looks like that's important to Erdogan. Fine, let Erdogan do what he likes there. But will the Russians take the same position in the Caucasus? They have a long history there. They know where that can lead. I don't think so. And I don't think the Iranians are going to watch what's happening there without finally saying, we can't allow it. You know, Iran has worked very hard to build a better relationship with Azerbaijan. But what have both Turkey and Iran learned? You can't trust them. You can't trust anything that you do with Erdogan or his friends in Azerbaijan. They have their own agenda. Astana, Sochi, all the agreements on paper were worth nothing, as Christine points out. We are still believing that we're in charge, that we're in control, and that we have pieces of paper that mean something. We're wrong. We can be betrayed next week by Mr. Erdogan as readily as he betrayed Russia. So I would say, if I were an Armenian, if you want to do business with us, partner with us, United States, we will be loyal. But loyalty works in two directions. We expect you to be loyal to us. And I would say the same thing to the Russians. And if the Americans say, we won't do business with you unless you throw the Russians out, well, that's impractical. That's like saying, we will no longer do business with Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Southern California because they're doing business with Mexico. It's ridiculous. It won't work that way. So I think you've got to stand your ground and say, we want the best with you, but we absolutely want good relations with our important strategic partners in the region. Is that an unreasonable suggestion?
No, it's not. And in fact, this is how it worked in the past. We managed to balance our relationship. Christine, please. Thank you, Colonel.
Yeah, thank you. So let's take a look at what Fidan, the foreign minister of Turkey, said. Okay. He said, Syria will be united, but we will not accept the SDF, which is the US-backed Kurdish forces. Okay. And we also came out of the Doha Forum, in which a number of the Middle Eastern powers basically ascribed to UN Resolution 2254, okay, which is basically a pathway for a so-called democratic or autonomous Syria, okay? The US has similarly endorsed such an approach, but this is where the similarities end. And what I'm asking your viewers to understand is that people can speak certain words and it sounds very similar, but they actually mean very different things, okay? Both the US and Turkey right now are endorsing a unified Turkey, or I'm sorry, a unified Syria. Does that mean that they're talking about the same thing? No. So at the moment, the only party that I can find that is actually sort of pushing for Syria to be divided into cantons, so to speak, is Israel. And why are they doing this? Because the Israeli Foreign Ministry actually came out, and this is in the past several weeks, basically saying that we need to get more involved with minorities in the Middle East. And I want to focus on the Kurds, and I want to focus on the Druze. Okay? And Israel has shored up its relationship with the Druze within Israel, okay, with a view towards influencing the Druze within Syria, okay? Israel also has a very strong relationship with the Kurds. They've also abrogated their commitments under the 1974 agreement by going beyond the parameters set forth in that agreement and effectively creating a buffer zone on a buffer zone on a buffer zone. It remains to be seen how far that will be pushed out and what people's tolerance levels are. But you can see with that type of approach from Israel that they're clearly gunning for some type of partition in which they have permanent influence. And rather than simply make airstrikes, they're going to want a ground position, I think, within Syria, focused on the minority communities in which they have an outsized influence. Now, Turkey at the moment is basically saying, no, we want a unified Syria. However, we will not accept the SDF, right, which is the Kurdish-backed force in northeastern Syria. Okay, so what does that actually mean? Who's the loser here? Well, the loser is clearly basically, the Gulf states, not Qatar. Qatar's a winner here. Qatar's opening up their embassy in Damascus. Okay, Qatar's doing victory laps with Turkey right now. But who are the losers? Syria, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt. So now let's go back to Armenia. How does Armenia sort of bring some balance to this? Well, guess what? If Turkish hegemony is going to be present together with Israeli hegemony in Syria, that needs to be balanced out, okay? That means basically that something has to block or stop Turkish hegemony, particularly in the South Caucasus. Who has an interest in doing that? The moderate Gulf states, Saudi, UAE, and then also Egypt, which is impacted. All those three countries are disproportionately impacted by the Muslim Brotherhood. That's where effectively Armenia needs to go. Now let's just talk about your earlier question in terms of, well, is there any talk in DC about military installations, etc., in Armenia? No, there isn't. Now, I'm not ruling out, you can't make a definitive statement that nothing will ever happen in the future. At the moment, though, I am aware of absolutely zero discussion in that regard. And that's important for Armenians to know. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that something couldn't happen in the future, but it's going to happen in a way that's different than what Armenians anticipate. Armenians, like usual, are very much looking for an external actor to come in and save the situation. Okay, that's not going to happen, but it's not going to happen for any external power. Okay, that's not the role of external powers, is to make or break your own foreign policy, your own strategy, your own economy. That's the job of Armenians. So, and as I've said to Armenians many, many times, and I'll say it again, if Armenia is strategically irrelevant in the region, it's strategically irrelevant to the great powers too, and that includes the United States. Okay? All of the discussion around US aid and whatnot, it's not been strategically focused. It's been effectively focused on charity and small programs that candidly are not going to be a make or break difference for Armenia. When you start quibbling and thinking a 250 million input for the United States is a strategic win for Armenia, you basically have lost perspective on where you stand in the larger pecking order. Okay? So at the end of the day, Armenia needs to up its game in the overall region and understand who the winners and losers are from the Syrian conflict and try to bring balance to that situation. Historically, that is how Armenians have acted in the region. Now, Pashinyan, of course, has sort of aligned himself with the real Armenia and not historic Armenia. Okay, so I'm not suggesting that Pashinyan and his administration can accomplish this as a standalone. At the moment, they've not accomplished this. But that's strategically where Armenia needs to go. It needs to sort of go back to its roots in terms of bringing balance, okay, to various different countries and groups in the region and facilitating stronger relationships and ensuring that basically one side doesn't dominate. But at the moment, the Western version of the Middle East is effectively Turkish and Israeli hegemony. I don't think that that's going to be acceptable. Now, people are holding their cards at this point to see what happens, but I feel pretty confident in saying over the next several years, if that in fact is the plan of the United States and the UK and other Western countries, it will just be deemed per se unacceptable. And I do want to bring your attention to an editorial piece that was written in Al-Ahram, which is the newspaper of record in Egypt, in which a former assistant foreign minister suggested a regional security framework that excludes the West in the greater Middle East that would consist of Egypt, Saudi, Turkey, and Iran. This is a very bold statement in a newspaper of record for Egypt, okay, in which the West is excluded. And the thinking is that having a regional security framework from the local actors is a better long-term outcome than being aligned with the great powers. Now, we don't know where things are going to go over the next several years. Keep in mind that the United States has staggering debt at this level, at this point, okay? Trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in debt. And as I've said many times, that debt is actually understated because certain companies like Boeing, for example, are effectively US government owned, so you can put all their debt on your balance sheet. Any company that basically has over 50% of its revenues or strategic revenues associated with the US government and its foreign adventures, that debt needs to be added to the US government balance sheet, as well as some of the debt that is held by Vanguard, BlackRock, and others in Ukraine. Okay, that also can be added to the US balance sheet, because I can assure you that US lenders are not going to be experiencing a shortfall if Ukraine basically folds or basically is forced into a peace agreement. There's some thinking that basically that Europeans will make the shortfall for Ukraine and basically pay off US banks. I don't think that that is the case. So at the end of the day, the U.S. is greatly constrained in terms of what it can accomplish over the next 4 years. And Armenia has to kind of fit within those realities. But it really is going to start at home. And it's going to start by basically revitalizing your role in the region with the actors who know you best, and understanding that if Armenia is going to position itself as a Western tool to poke the various countries, as opposed to an Armenia that's well recognized and understood as historical communities throughout the Middle East, ultimately the loser will be Armenia.
Thank you. Razmik?
If I could add one
Sure.
thing that is worthy of your attention, I really think that a war will break out between Turkey and the Kurds. I think it's inevitable. And part of what's happened in Syria positions the Turks to crush the Kurds in Syria, which is a core component of a future Kurdish nation state. And by the way, the Turkish population will support that. And that's very important for us to understand. Now, having said that, what did the Israelis do? They're joined at the hip with the Kurds. Are they going to become involved? I don't think so. So watch what happens to the Kurds and think about what Armenia needs to do in the event that war breaks out and the Kurds march in to northeast Syria to wipe out this Kurdish state. And we're not going to stop it. I can guarantee you that, because we're not prepared to embroil ourselves in a larger regional war. Remember that this thing called HTS, and we have 11,000 that we've trained and equipped and so forth, former Al-Qaeda types down in the southeast of the country. You put all of these together, you get something in the neighborhood of maybe 25,000 or more terrorists. They are the light cavalry that precedes the main army. That's the way we should look at this. The main army is Turkey. These are just the light cavalry formations, overrunning areas that are weakly defended, staking out posts for future Turkish military operations. That's the way we have to look at this. And that's going to have a big impact. And America is not going to involve itself, as it has in the past, to fight the Turkish armed forces.
I think that's a very good point, and I think that's exactly what we should be watching. It's already happening. From what I understand, there have been clashes with the Kurdish forces in Syria. There have been some beheadings and killings among various forces in Syria already, and I hope that we don't have the kind of instability that we had in Iraq for a long time after Saddam Hussein's overthrow. Razmik, did you have a question?
Yeah, I would like to ask about the Ukrainian developments, because there are different expectations from Donald Trump, who promised to end the war in Ukraine. So what to expect from this direction?
President Trump is right in the sense that he wants to end the war. The problem is the notion of quickly ending something like this is very unlikely. And I wish he hadn't said, I can end it in 24 hours. He really can't. He could come close by simply suspending all military aid to Ukraine. But again, many of the same actors that want to embroil us in the Middle East right now in support of this joint hegemony between Israel and Turkey are also interested in prolonging the war in Ukraine in the hope that somehow or another they can force back the Russians or have an impact on the outcome. Everything in Ukraine will be decided by Moscow. It'll be decided because of a clear-cut, unambiguous battlefield victory. The Russians have the forces, they have the capabilities, we don't. And no one in their right mind is going to march into Western Ukraine to challenge the Russians. All of the European armies are boutique operations. The only army in NATO that could conceivably make an impact is the Turkish army, and the Turks are not going to fight for Ukraine. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have to excuse myself. I think I'm running out of time here. I apologize, but I've got to leave.
Thank you, Colonel. Thank you very much indeed for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Christine?
Yeah, can I just make a couple comments?
Sure. It's all you now. Go ahead.
Okay.
We said half an hour and it took almost.
I know. You know what? I was just looking at the time briefly and I was like, it's way over,
Yes.
but we're having fun. So let's just
Yes.
keep on talking.
Yes.
What I was going to say is this, is that, look, I know Trump said, hey, look, we're going to have peace in 24 hours. But one of the key things to understand is the political situation in Europe at this point is quite unstable. And I'd like to point out to everyone that the Germans have upcoming elections. Okay. So this is going to be a very, very important election in terms of Germany's policies towards Ukraine in foreign policy overall. So I think it's a bit premature to think that we can come to a consensus on Ukraine, the US as a standalone, absent support from some key European allies. Okay, so now it doesn't mean that the US can't pull the plug, but Biden's been pumping money and weapons, etc., as much as he can, such that Ukraine can sort of ride things out a little bit, right? So Biden and Trump are at odds at this point. And so how much runway does that give Ukraine? I'm not exactly sure, but that basically gives the Europeans time to basically get their political situation in order, such that they can decide ultimately where they want to go. But look, there's political instability in Europe. Will Starmer continue to be, in charge of UK? Unclear. He's basically not going to be in sync with Trump in many of his policies. So I think it remains to be seen really what happens. But the US didn't go into Ukraine alone, is not going to get out alone.
And to that point, Colonel Macgregor's not with us anymore, but in your opinion, how will this, what kind of a potential peace settlement may we have in Ukraine? Because now I'm picking up some information that there are delegations being exchanged with Western countries, with Ukraine talking about a ceasefire now. There's talk of peacekeepers. I mean, do you think it's going to go the Korean way? Is it going to be a frozen conflict and then peace negotiations? And how will Ukraine accept this, basically losing 4 regions on top of Crimea?
Well, I mean, look, I'm reading the press just like everyone else. And what the consensus seems to be, insofar as one can speak of a consensus as it pertains to Ukraine, is if we make everyone equally unhappy, this means we'll have a long-lasting ceasefire or peace. Okay? So everyone is sort of unhappy in different ways, and hence, therefore, we can all live with the result. So the question is whether that will hold true, whether that will be the case. And I think the answer is no. I think the answer is no, because at the end of the day, one side is going to seek advantage at some point and say, I'm going to drive the outcome. And you can see that with Syria. You can see that with Nagorno-Karabakh. When people talk about a frozen conflict, it's still a conflict, okay? It's still a conflict, and it can go live at any point, and people are seeking their advantage. So people get very complacent when you talk about frozen conflict. So, and look, insofar as there's support for Ukraine being in NATO, I think that will continue to be a bright red line for Russia. And candidly, I think it's just fundamentally unsupportable. There's really from my perspective, I fail to understand the strategic rationale when the Cold War was won and Ukraine was not part of NATO. I mean, for me, it's sort of putting the cart before the horse. If you want a strategic, initiative to basically contain Russian influence, then do so. But that does not hinge exclusively or primarily on Ukraine. Russia has many other interests. And so insofar as the United States wants to pursue that course of action, I fail to see on many components of that.
We're taught, as you know, we're told every day that in the new administration, there are a lot of pro-Armenian people, pro-Armenian forces, people who sympathize with Armenia, and that our diplomatic mission in Washington is doing everything it can to establish contacts with these people. We're going to have a lot of influence, and Trump is going to be on our side. On the other hand, we talked about for about an hour now about the real priorities of the Trump administration: Israel, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and the fact that there are meetings with AIPAC and Azeri representatives taking place. So is it really realistic for local media outlets sponsored by, whom? Is it really realistic to tell us that Trump is going to be pro-Armenian? There are people in his future administration who are pro-Armenian. What can we really expect? Thank you.
So look, I know that there has been media, both in the US and Armenia, talking about pro-Armenian Trump appointees. So say, for example, Tulsi Gabbard, okay? maybe Rubio, right, the new Secretary of State, etc. Okay. What I would say is this, that I think Trump is coming in, unlike his first administration, in which sort of he was pulling people in as individual actors, okay, who had more autonomy because he wasn't come in with well-formed policies and teams, etc. The approach for this administration, I think, will be very different, okay? He has a very clear agenda coming in. I think that agenda is very pro-Israel. It's very anti-Iran. Those are his priorities. So I don't want to come out and say, hey, look, he's anti-Armenian. The question is where does Armenia fall in terms of strategic priorities? It could just fall off the cliff, okay? Again, it's very presumptuous to basically say that because someone is not antagonistic or hostile to Armenians or sympathetic to Armenians as Christians, that now they're a strategic priority for the United States. Those are two completely different things. If we want to be a strategic priority for the United States, then act like one, right? But that's not a handout. That's actually being a strategic, valuable player in that region that has articulated a viewpoint on how it can help the United States vis-a-vis global competitor China, etc. So again, I do not see Armenia currently having huge inroads, or really any inroads with the Trump administration. This is exactly what I observed firsthand, and I'm going to basically state the truth as clearly as I can. Now, I think it's important that we look at the new U.S. ambassador to Turkey, Tom Barrack. He's very well positioned to get Trump's ear. Okay, he was part of a private equity fund. His net worth is in the tens of millions of dollars, and he's worked with Trump over a period of years. We don't have anything comparable to that in terms of access, okay, to Trump. Now you say to yourself, okay, can we use Bulos basically to gain access to Trump? Okay, but we've had limited success with that. Okay, and that's all I'll say on that. At the end of the day, we do not have a clear inroad with the Trump administration at the moment, and that puts us at maximum risk because Azerbaijan does. Azerbaijan has AIPAC. Azerbaijan has Israel as an ally. Now we have a clear ambassador named to Turkey from the United States who is a Trump insider. We don't have anything comparable, nor does the Armenian government, nor do the Armenian lobbying organizations basically in DC. So we're playing from a very weak position at this point, and that's going to have to change very rapidly if there's any hope that Armenia will effectively be bounced around by different parties as supporting their own viewpoints versus having an independent strategic initiative within the Trump administration that benefits Armenia specifically and directly. Hey, Arthur, I can't hear you. Oh, sure. Was that helpful? Did that answer your question?
Yes. I'm just saying thank you so much. I'm sorry, I muted my mic. These are very sobering facts. I mean, having Turkey and Turkish lobbyists on the other side, having Azerbaijan, Azeri influence and Azeri lobbyists, and as if that was not enough, having AIPAC, which is, an organization that basically has the last say in U.S. foreign policy in our region. I mean, you're right. I mean, unless we do something pretty rapidly, we're going to be very, very weak in this equation. And given what we said about Erdogan and his plans, I don't see the U.S. jumping to our help in our region.
And can I just say one thing too?
Sure.
Which is, I'm at a loss as to why the Armenian defense minister is meeting with the Pentagon and Lloyd Austin. That is an outgoing administration. It is not the incoming administration. And if there's one thing that Trump is very sensitive to, he's very sensitive to social media, photos, etc. So what is the overriding image? It's basically Armenia caring intensely about what the former administration says, thinks about Armenia. That is not beneficial to Armenia, not at this point. I can think of no other country that has given as much airtime to an outgoing administration as Armenia. And that's not just the meeting at the Pentagon, that's also Samantha Power going to the Armenian embassy in DC, okay, to spend time with Ambassador Makuntz, okay? Again, now you can say, okay, Pashinyan was at Notre Dame and took a photo with Trump, But at the end of the day, these are all being reviewed and filtered by a number of people. And at the end of the day, they're going to say, okay, where are Armenians' loyalties? Where is their interest in having an own standalone relationship with the incoming administration? Okay, it appears to be divided loyalties. And like, for example, the Kurds, one of the things they're saying in social media now and publicly is, we called to congratulate Trump first, right? People are lining up saying who came first. Meanwhile, the Pashinyan administration is giving airtime to an outgoing administration that in essence is loathed by the incoming administration. Why? It does not make sense.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks, and please thank Colonel Macgregor on our behalf, and I certainly will be sure to do that. Razmik, thanks so much for running this brilliantly.
And thank you so much. I just want to remind our audience that together with Dr. Artur Khachikian, we had an interview with Mr. Douglas Macgregor, a retired US Army colonel, and Christina Arakelian, a senior economic and business management consultant, and currently a fellow at the Armenian Society of Fellows. Thank you so much for watching this interview. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.